Hello, this is Tyler again. Today, wanted to record another video talking about a concept I brought up in the last video I made, and that is what I call the coming culture war. And I know when people hear that, they see visions of like white nationalist people marching in Charlottesville and crazy stuff like that. And I think that's the wrong takeaway from what I am trying to get at. So I wanted to clarify that concept a little bit more in the world as we look at it moving forward into the future, right? And I think the way I look at it is that as the world continues to globalize and we continue to have increased trade and increased immigration between countries and increased swapping of cultures, I guess you could say, and we see this very prevalently in California, where I'm from, and across the United States, and in Japan and in China, they've been inspired heavily by Western culture in China and Japan heavily. I think you see that when you go there. So as the world continues to swap its cultural creations and become a more global commerce system, instead of being these different nations that are all competing against each other, we all have to grapple with the fact that we will leave behind certain cultural markers of our more homogenized systems. And a really, I think, obvious way to look at this is like the way Europe has transformed in the last 200 years, where Europe used to be a bunch of infighting between their own, kind of ancient lines of different barbarians and different pagan religious groups, and the descendants of the Vikings, the descendants of the Celts, the descendants of the Gauls, the descendants of the original Anglos. All these different groups used to war with each other for thousands and thousands of years, and they had strong cultural boundaries as to how they defined their differences. And even within groups that we would consider very similar because of their geographic similarity in location, like Portugal and modern day Portugal and Spain, have massively different histories, and that's why they define themselves with a country's border today. And I think when you look at Europe today, they have a much more homogenized culture across all the countries as a whole. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's just a fact, right? So when I analyze the change of Europe from being a bunch of warring city-states and minor countries, it's now transformed into the modern European Union. And even though some countries aren't a part of the European Union, they all pretty much allow free travel between the different countries. They have similar cultural values. They're very, very pro-human rights when compared to the rest of the world. All the European countries typically lean kind of left-leaning, like most of the westernized world. Like all of the westernized world is socialist to some degree, but you see more socialism in the European countries. The cultural homogeny is not limited to the city-states. It is instead a continent-wide level of cultural homogeny. The negative to this change that you see in Europe is that the original cultural markers and value systems of the Gauls, the Celts, the Romans, the original groups, the groups that predate those, even, the ancient Greeks and all this stuff, is that when you unify your cultural value system to a wider net of people, you do have to forego your earlier cultural markers that you may have drawn separatist lines at. As we've seen with Europe, I think this has been a universally positive thing for all those countries. They seem to work very well together. They have lots of trade between the different countries. Certain countries that maybe produce more of a certain crop are able to trade it with other countries in there that need certain crops. I mean, I think there's obviously some argument that the dependence of Germany and France and a lot of the powers over there on getting natural gas from Russia has shown itself to be a major problem if Putin wants to continue to push aggressively against them. But they seem to be investing in nuclear, at least the smart countries are, and that seems to be the solution on that front. So when I look at it today in the modern world, we're not looking at increasing cultural homogeny across Europeans, right? We're looking at increasing cultural homogeny across all the different continents and the people within them. And everyone has at stake their own cultural markers and the value systems that are important to them. And this is an extremely loaded topic for people because everyone is partial to the systems they are born into, and they have good reason to be. You all of us carry the responsibility of performatively acting out the wants of our ancestors because we were brought onto this earth in some way to be the continuation of the cultural value system that created us in the first place, which is our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, all the way back, and where they chose to, align themselves culturally and how they chose to write their moral laws into their system. It's a much bigger problem when you're looking at the entire world becoming culturally homogenized, because fundamentally there's such a discrepancy in the religious doctrines that some of these different areas carry and what values are important to them, that I don't know if the West would be gaining a lot by continuing to grow more tolerant to certain belief systems from the East or Middle East. Like specifically, I'm a big critic of Islam in my day-to-day life, even because if you just look at the doctrines of the religion, they're almost encouraged by the book that they say is their word of God to forcefully convert other people not of the Islamic religion, or more specifically, even if they are in control of the country and it's under Sharia law, to impose extra taxes upon non-Islamic members of their society. So even in countries under Sharia law that are what we might consider modernized, they still participate in in-group preference that I think we find really disgusting here in the West. I think we try to fight against that type of in-group religious preference, and it's part of what makes us such a beautiful country to live in today. So the reason I'm making a video about it is because the culture war is not something that is violent. The culture war is your willingness to define cultural boundaries that matter to you in a world that is becoming culturally homogenized across all 7 different continents. And I understand every other group's interest in keeping their cultural markers as the bedrock of society as we move towards one world government, whatever you want to call it. And I'm not saying the one world government's happening in my lifetime, but the idea that the world will all eventually just work together in a more unified system, I think is an inevitability, whether that's 50 years from now or 5,000 years from now. The reality is, over that time frame, are we going to align ourselves with the westernized value system of believing in free speech, in believing in women's right to choose their sexual partners? Are we going to believe in a lower taxation rate for the working class? Are we going to align ourselves with what I would define as more Christian moral systems, or are we going to sacrifice those Christian moral systems in the name of tolerance and instead impose on ourselves some degree of sometimes Sharia law? Or sometimes, the issue becomes like, I don't want to just point out the Middle East, because I think China is another great example of this, where they don't have the same nationwide post-Enlightenment Christian value system that values freedom of speech, humanitarian rights, or the ability to criticize your own country. Like, a massive part of what I am so incredibly proud of to be an American is that we all get to talk shit about our country on a day-to-day basis. And that is part of what defines us as being an American. I think part of your responsibility as an American with the ability to have freedom of speech is to complain about all the inefficiencies and discrepancies you're unhappy with in your country all the time. That's why we fought to have free speech. And I will not I will have no part in seeing the world become more culturally homogenized around a system that doesn't celebrate these viewpoints that I think have proven themselves to obviously be the best system of government for any group of people living beneath it. So in the future, I just want to clarify that when I refer to what I describe as the culture war, it is the long-standing inevitable conflict of which cultural ideas will come out on top as the world culturally homogenizes. Similarly to what happened in Europe, similarly to what happened across ancient China, how it all became a single unified country with its, more simplified value system. It's not to say that everything is forgotten, but we must define for ourselves what is the moral system and what is the system of law that the world will adopt under unified rule. And I know what I will be voting for when it comes time for that. And I have no willingness to adopt any other system of belief that imposes new rules upon me, because in my country, we created a system that allowed us to never go back to that way of living. We're not going to go back to being serfs in this country. And I would like to hope that every other country would like to get to that point at some point in their future. But I also hope that we have no willingness in this country to ever go back to that point. And sometimes I think people are not always as aligned with maintaining our Western belief system as they should be. It's not something you have to worry about on a day-to-day basis, but we all must continue to defend our right to freedom of speech and our right to freedom of religion and our right to choose our sexual partners, to have our own. I'm a strong Christian, and I'm not going to be the person to tell gay people they can't get married. Like, this is the country of freedom after all. But you can't sit there on the other side of the aisle and tell me I can't own a rifle that the police force in my county uses. There's no reason that the average citizenry of the country should be less armed than private security. Tucker Carlson made a great point against that one congressman or whatever. It's a very famous clip where he's saying that why should his wife have a less powerful firearm than the congressman's security guard. And I think we should all be on the same page about that. And I don't know where America lost its consensus on our shared cultural values. And I hope we all begin to agree on what defines us again, especially in the coming culture war. Thank you for listening again. If you tuned into this episode, I'll have more stuff coming out in the next couple weeks. I want to talk about more of the stuff, freedom of speech, and what are our central American values that I think were kind of violated the last couple of years. So look forward to putting out more of these, and thank you for listening.